Our next speaker is Professor Joshua Long. Joshua Long serves as the acting dean of the College of Business and is associate professor of economics at Indiana Institute of Technology. He holds a doctorate with a research focus on economics education from Capella University and dual master's degrees in economics from Welsh College and business administration from Indiana Tech. He will be speaking this morning on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, exit strategies, and outlook. Let's welcome Professor Long.
A little bit earlier, I was getting a little nostalgic. I'm not a graduate of U of D Mercy. However, three of my professors from Walsh College are three of our speakers tonight, Mr. Bruhan, Mr. Wiglars, and Mr. Reiser. I was talking to Mr. Bruhan that it was 15 years ago, this fall, that I was in his Econ 503 class, Survey of Economics. And I really knew very little about economics at the time. And here, 15 years later, I'm standing here, so I just want to publicly thank each of you for the inspiration you've been in setting me on a career that's landed me in a really funny spot, being the dean of a business school, at least for the semester. So, anyhow, every time I'm invited to come, Mr. Reiser keeps on saying, "Josh, tell us about the Fed." I'm like, why on earth why should I talk about the Fed? So, kind of a command performance, so here we go. Most of us in this room, I assume, have taken macroeconomics, at least a basic course in that. So we're probably, I would assume that to at least some extent, all of us in the room are familiar with the role of central banks around the world. If we think back to about 100 years ago, plus or minus, before 1913 with the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, commonly it was held that banking systems were unstable, people would lose their money in runs on banks and things of that nature. So in very well documented stories, at least in this country, central banking was born with the passage of the Federal Reserve Act by Woodrow Wilson in December 1913. Since that time, the Federal Reserve has become, at least in this country, a very central part of the economic heartbeat of the country, whether we like it or not, and also has existed as kind of a template for the formation of central banks in other parts of the world. So it's kind of a reality that we have to live with. All the free market economists have different views on central banking, including Mises, Hayek, and others, and even they disagree on the inevitable nature of central banking. However, it's a fact of life that we have to take a look at. Mr. Fisher made reference to the so-called Great Recession of 07 to 09. It was a real event. People lost lots of money in their investments. A pretty good contraction in the U.S. economy, if I recall, for was 18 months until the summer of 2009. During that time, the Federal Reserve, in order to be true to its congressional mandate to maintain full employment and price stability, oh my gosh, I sound like a Keynesian now. Anyhow, they decided to do what they're supposed to do, to inject liquidity and credit into the economy, basically being the barkeeper. The party's not going so well, so what do? For drinks in the house. And that's virtually what they did. Just to recap briefly, most of you will hopefully recall, at least maybe as a nightmare, but trying to study for a macro test. But you probably recall some of the major tools that the Federal Reserve has at its disposal, and has had at its disposal for many years. Open market operations, buying and selling of U.S. government securities, bonds, things of that nature. So instead of my talking the whole time, do any of you recall some of the other traditional tools? So open market operations is one. Other two? And these people can't answer over here. The reserve requirement ratio. How about one more? Oh, come on. I know it's Saturday morning. Discount rate, right? Sound vaguely familiar? Okay. If not, go back to hit the textbooks a little bit more. Anyhow, so again, the point is that the Federal Reserve traditionally has a wide range, has some tools at its disposal to go and to do its work, to try to being a counterbalancing effect in the economy. However, as I've discussed in previous symposia, I don't want to recap all those things, but the Federal Reserve they cooked up quite a few unorthodox tools, new tools, in order to get liquidity into the markets, get credit into the markets, or to take those things out as necessary. So, which leads us to our topic for today's presentation, which is, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, which is kind of a running tally of what the Fed's been up to. Now, this screen, I kind of didn't realize how small the screen would be. This is the basic balance sheet. And so, being a freshly minted MBA from about a year ago, I figured, oh, balance sheet, goody, let's go and actually apply some of the stuff that I learned. So anyhow, this is just simply a record of what the Fed has done, and I'll take you through some of the finer details in more of a line graph form. Basically, with the exception of, I'm pretty sure I may have, so this is showing assets right here. As most of you probably recall the basic accounting equation, assets equals what? Help me out. Okay, real good. So just to make this very, very simple, owner's equity in this case is a very, very, very small number. So I think it's about 40, I have to go back, I think it's about $40 billion. So let's just throw that out. That's small potatoes. That's small potatoes. So for the purpose of our exercise here, let's just assume that assets are equal to liabilities based on the numbers that are here. So, and this tells a story about what the Fed has done. I want to move, I think, so pretty much the Fed has assets of about $4.4 trillion. This is based on the last quarterly update from the Board of Governors in the fall of last year. They haven't updated this. So again, they have bought, most of these items here are securities off the market. And if you go to, you see where it says, you have the purple bar across the top there? If you go down, it says securities held outright. So what exactly has the Federal Reserve bought off the open market as an excuse to inject new credit or liquidity into markets? What have they been up to? Overall, what have they been up to? Just to head down on the list here. So, category number one, normally I would ask for a drum roll in class for this one, but they're sitting on about $2.5 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities. Okay, that's a pretty big chunk of U.S. government bonds. Do any of you recall the overall debt outstanding of the U.S. government? Yeah, about 20 trillion. Yeah, just sitting at 19.9 as of a couple of days ago. Unfortunately, that trend doesn't seem to be changing at all. But the point is that the Fed is sitting on, let's see, if it's 20 trillion, they're sitting on, they're sitting on 2.5, what is that, 12.5% roughly? Oh, how nice, how very convenient. So the Fed is buying up the debt of the U.S. government. So the U.S. government's buying up its own debt. And that's a nice trick. It's a very convenient trick. So, moving on here. The second biggest category, and again, I don't look at this data every single day, but this blew my mind a little bit. I think most of us probably have some memory, at least those of us who were in the working world or in the investing world back during the Great Recession. One of the big buzz terms was mortgage-backed securities. We all know that that was one of the areas that got toasted pretty bad. That's one sector of the market where fingers got burned off pretty badly. And the Fed was in, they had different monetary policy, or different tools in place to basically take some of these investments off the market. Okay, but let's think about it. It's 2017 now. The recession started in 07. It was 10 years ago. That was a decade ago. And so I think, I kind of forgot about mortgage-backed securities. Well, if you go to this, I'm going to zip ahead to the next screen because this shows, actually, it's not going to help out. Okay, so coming in at number 2, the Fed is out of that 4.5 trillion, they're sitting on 1.7 trillion in mortgage-backed securities. That's a lot, and they're still sitting on it. Eric and I were talking about this a little bit last night over at Mr. Reiser's place, and there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding those mortgage-backed securities that the Fed is sitting on. 1.7 trillion. And let me move on here, and I will try to, and then I'll try to make some more comments about that and the relevance of those mortgage-backed securities to the market. The overall U.S. Treasury securities, that happens all the time. The Fed is constantly buying and selling those in a balancing act to try to balance and to try to maintain different key interest rates, including the federal funds rate. So again, that happens every day. The mortgage-backed securities, that doesn't happen every day, the purchase of all those assets. So let's move on here. This next trend simply shows a couple of things regarding just some historical trends over the last 7 years. And I have to credit the Board of Governors for all these charts. They conveniently presented all the data. So the Fed has, think about this here for a moment. The recession has been over since summer, right? 2009, basically. 2009, yeah, July 1st, the start of the third quarter, that's right. So the recession was officially over. We've been in a period of expansion for 8 years, plus or minus. But wait a second, what is the Fed up to? In terms of overall securities, they've been, at least up till middle of 2013, they were buying securities, and so very simple. The Fed can do one of two things when it comes to the buying and selling, whether it's U.S. government bonds or mortgage-backed securities or other financial investments. They can buy or they sell them. If they buy them off the market, what happens? They decide to make a decision to buy some of these goodies off the market, the so-called toxic assets in the case of mortgage-backed securities. And what do? They pay with newly created credit. Again, making money out of nothing, essentially. But the point is that they're not buying these over the last couple of years, but they're sitting on them. They're sitting on a huge pile of these items that they've bought. So I kind of have I kind of see, I have this mental image of the Fed, of this imaginary vault with, U.S., government securities belching out on the one side. On the other side, you have these mortgage-backed securities. It simply means they've been very, very busy buying stuff off the market, and they've injected a lot of credit. A lot of credit. Moving along here. All right, so this again shows a couple of other trends here. This focuses on U.S. Treasury securities, which again they basically flatlined. And then with mortgage-backed securities, there's been a little bit of fluctuation, but not much. You can see that the federal agency debt securities, you had a little bubble there, you had a little blip, and then that's gone down. So it looks in a lot of ways that the Fed is just, in terms of what they're buying off the open market, they're kind of in a holding pattern. And we'll talk about the downside of that. So they bought, and now they're kind of holding, as it were. This shows liabilities right here. So again, we said that with the exception of that little 40 billion or so, plus or minus in capital or in equity. Let's just assume again that liabilities are equal to assets. So what has the Fed spit out or injected out into the market in order to pay for all these goodies that they've been buying? The biggest item, if you go down, and again I apologize for the small numbers, other deposits held by depository institutions. That's the number one thing that's been injected. So credit has been injected to the tune of $2 trillion overall into the economy. So very, very simply, either perhaps in an indirect way, that's bought goodies, financial investments, bonds, other financial assets. And one of the ways that they've done that is by buying those from these institutions and then giving them credit. Number two, we've got coming in, so that's $2 trillion there. Then we come in at 1.4 trillion in currency. I remember when I first started teaching economics, I used a little video that was produced, about the Federal Reserve. And in that video, this was probably produced 15 years ago, they talked about the total amount of currency that was in circulation in the U.S. market and other parts of the global market that used U.S. currency. It was at about $500 billion. So that for me, that's just kind of a historical reference point. So currently, we have just shy of $1.5 trillion in banknote in Federal Reserve notes that are out in circulation somewhere. And then everything else, some of these other categories, there are a few that are denominated in the hundreds of billions. We have reverse purchase agreements, and again, I'm not going to get into all the technicalities of these, but the point is that the Fed has injected credit for currency into these different sectors of the market. Okay. This simply shows the story, or tells the story in a couple of different ways here. So we have the balance of, so we have currency in circulation, which is the black line, constant increase, no big surprise. So more Federal Reserve notes out in circulation right now. The blue line shows the Treasury balance. I'm not going to talk so much about that. But the other thing that kind of makes me scratch my head a little bit is, or that caught my eye when I was looking at this, was the balance of deposits of depository institutions at the Fed, because the Federal Reserve, for a range of reasons, allows member banks to make deposits from the bank directly to the Federal Reserve Bank. For those of you familiar with fractional reserve banking, banks are required to have required reserves, and then they have excess reserves. And so the Fed, those funds are deposited at the Fed, and the Fed will pay different rates of interest and that's subject to change to encourage banks to maybe deposit more deposits, to get currency and credit in and out of the market as necessary. Again, I guess the basic message I'm trying to get across with some of these little sidebar things is that this is a delicate balancing act. Very, very delicate. Kind of, I use this bad analogy, it's like smoking over a gas can. It might be cool to smoke a cigarette, but you're working with something that's explosive, and that's money and credit. So if you're not careful, if you flick some ash down the open gas can, you might have an explosive response. So if the Federal Reserve messes up, they implement the wrong type of policy, there can be some pretty nasty side effects. All right, moving ahead here. So, bottom line, the Fed is sitting on, I think the biggest thing right here, they're sitting on approximately $1.7 trillion in mortgage-backed securities. There's no real definitive time when they might spin these things off. And so one of the questions that's been asked in the business media, Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, and other commentators, is when on earth is the Fed going to kind of undo some of the stimulus that it did to kind of put itself back in a neutral position where it's able to have a wide range of options in order to either stimulate or to maybe rein in the economy based on trends in inflation or unemployment and so forth. So, just to run down a couple of quick macroeconomic indicators. So what is the Fed looking at? Well, real GDP is currently at in last report, 1.9% growth, well under the average. So weak economic growth, maybe many of you have heard how this recovery has been a weak one. So unemployment sitting at 4.8%. So probably very close to the so-called natural rate of unemployment. Basically, we're employing, at least in terms of the actual labor market, we're employing quite a few people who want to get a job. I'm not saying that they're good-paying jobs necessarily, but according to this, according to the way that the Bureau of Labor Stats tracks this, the unemployment rate looks acceptable to the Fed. However, there is a little problem. inflation, price inflation, as measured by some of the, especially the consumer price index, and a few of the other major price indexes that the Fed watches very closely, is weak at best. It's weak at best. The unadjusted rate of inflation for the last year, not seasonally adjusted, it's at 2.5%. If you make corrections for seasonal fluctuations, we're in the 1 point some odd range. So the point is that it looks like, in terms of just looking at that dashboard, it looks like the Fed, it looks like things aren't so bad in terms of some of those main indicators, with the exception of weak economic growth. So this particular period of expansion is growing a little long in the tooth. Business cycles are, the actual duration of the business cycle varies considerably, but the question becomes, what happens if there's another economic crisis, a financial crisis, another recession? What is the Fed going to do? What will they be able to do? And Janet Yellen, the chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, has spoken about reducing the level of assets on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet in order to give them more wiggle room. I'm not getting that silly microphone there. I'm not used to those things. But anyhow, so there's been discussion, while times are at least in a rather expansionary trend, the Federal Reserve's talking about when they might spin some of these assets off. But the Fed said, not yet. Not yet. They're talking about it, but they're not quite there yet. So the question becomes, when they do that, let's assume that this particular period of expansion continues to grow. And I mean, nobody wants to see a recession in terms of the effects. Sometimes recessions are, they can have a kind of cleaning out effect of malinvestments, if you recall from the Austrian trade cycle theory. But the point is, nobody wants to feel the nasty side effects of a recession. So let's assume that we continue through a period of expansion here. The question becomes, when are they going to start selling some of these assets to kind of give the balance sheet cooling off period, so when the next storm comes, they actually have room in the barn, so to speak, with the balance sheet to bring some of the animals in, to shelter markets a little bit. Well, in the short run, the Federal Reserve has noticed or has stated that there will be no significant changes in the level of assets because they believe there's still risks that are at play. And also, in the longer term, they've stated that eventually they'll get around to it. This brings us to this thing right here. So, when the Fed actually does get around to undoing their stimulus, as it were, to loosening the spring, as it were, what's going to happen? Hazlitt in the Economics 1 lesson tells us the art of economics consists in looking at the effects of whatever is done, some sort of economic policy, not only for one person, but for everybody. The immediate effects and the longer-term effects. And so that's really the question to ask. When the Fed does start to unwind their balance sheet, to loosen it up a little bit, what will happen? Well, the first thing is that it'll have a contractionary effect on the money supply. Very simple. The Fed buys, and at least in this respect, the Fed buys or sells assets. It's that simple. If they go into a selling stage, what happens? They sell the bonds. They sell the assets, whatever those things happen to be. And they take liquidity, credit out of the market. I'm not sure markets can really withstand a reduction in the money supply right now. But let's face it. If the economy is only growing, let's assume that these figures are robust. If the economy is only growing 1.9%, and it's taken $4 trillion worth of stimulus to get to that point, the downside might be very interesting. Very, very interesting. Who's the economist who said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon? Friedman, wasn't it? This could have perhaps a deflationary trend on the economy. And lastly, I think that the major takeaway is that if the Fed were to start selling off some of these assets, which is probably inevitable, there's a lot of uncertainty right now. Commentators are saying we're not sure how the market will react. We don't know the state of those. Eric and I were talking about this earlier. We're not quite sure. What is the condition? What is the duration? What is the composition of these mortgage-backed securities. As far as we can see, at least from my perspective, they're a line on the Fed's balance sheet. But again, those are real investments. And it's kind of like not knowing whether or not the patient's ready to come out of the hospital, so to speak, and go back, be admitted to the open market. We don't know what that effect will be. So, I would say there are two possible threats: a monetary deflation and also market uncertainty when this actually occurs. Thank you very much.